Okay, so this is the final instalment of Chapter 2, looking at the Chapter 2 high-level topics. So the high-level topics for Chapter 2 is Corporate Culture, 2.5, and Employer and Employee Relations, 2.6. So we'll start with Corporate Culture. This is a topic that doesn't appear very often in exams, and there are actually about 6 different theories associated to this particular chapter. But what I would say is that it's not essential that you're well read in all of them, so long as you have a good understanding of 2 or 3. So I'm going to pick out the main 3 corporate culture theories today. The first one was written by a guy called Charles Handy. Charles Handy's written various business theories. He did Handy's Shamrock, that looks at the balance of the workplace, having core employees, peripheral employees and outsourced employees in order to have a good flexible work environment. So he's come up with various different theories that we've applied throughout the course, and this is one of his theories. He talks about the different cultures that exist in business. Charles Handy's power culture talks about a dominant individual or a group holding decision-making power. He would describe this as a power culture. And he talks about this being a situation where obviously decision-making is very swift. Formal job titles and positions are not particularly highly regarded because decision-making power exists only with a certain few groups of people. So regardless whether you're called a manager, if you are not within the inner circle of that organisation, then you may not have managerial decision-making power. He says that signs of power culture come in various forms, things like reserved parking spaces for the boss, or reserved bathrooms, washrooms in the office that are only for senior executives, reserved break lounges or restrooms that are only for the senior executives. So you can imagine that in a power culture, this is the kind of environment that the ground level employees build a level of resentment, and there may be a sort of an us and them kind of a environment in what you would describe a power culture. So all you would need to be able to do is, if you were to be asked to describe the kind of culture of a particular company or organisation, power culture may be a necessary term to describe that kind of very centralised decision making. Charles Handy also says that you have what are called role cultures, and these are highly structured organisations with formal rules and procedures, and it's about this is my job, that's your job, and our lines don't cross. Very formal job descriptions, very clear lines of accountability, but quite poor in the form of communication and teamwork and sort of sharing of roles between departments. Whereas you have the alternative of that when he describes a task culture. He describes a task culture as these organisations that don't focus on job descriptions but focus on the job to be done, the task to be completed. And if that task to be completed requires a team to be made up of various different people from various different backgrounds and experiences and various different roles within the organisation in order to share best practice and share activities, then that's what happens within a task culture. It's the focus is not on the specific job description of the individual, but more on the task to be completed. And lastly, we have these sort of person cultures based upon the skill sets of an individual. So person cultures are when staff in similar positions with similar expertise form groups to share their knowledge and skills. It's in larger organisations with different branches like commercial retailing or types of professions like accounting, surgeons, lawyers, where the actual skill set and role that person fulfills means that there is a certain individual hierarchy that they're perceived to be in their own right, an expert of their field. And so we have lots of individuals who are very good at their jobs rather than this sort of team approach. So Handy just describes businesses by these 4 cultures. And again, it's not a case that you would be needing to apply Handy's theory to anything in this, but what you may be asked to do is, if you were to be given a case study of a particular business that described something along these lines, you may be asked to apply the term person culture, task culture, role culture, power culture to describe that environment, and make a link to a case study to do so. So we have Handy's cultures. We also have Deal and Kennedy. And Deal and Kennedy base their cultures around two categories of measurement. The level of risk in the environment, is it a very high risk environment or is it quite a low risk environment? And the speed of feedback, the speed of reward. So again, is it very fast feedback and reward, or is it quite slow feedback and reward? So obviously risk is pretty clear to understand. If you work in high risk environments, you might be talking about the level of uncertainty in an organisation. It could be stock brokerage firms and something like that, very stressful businesses to work in. That we could be relating to. It's generally high levels of investment. When we talk about feedback and reward, we're talking about whether or not the actual measure of success is quick. So the feedback, how are we doing? Can we see how we're doing? Do we understand how we're doing? How, where's that feedback coming from? So that might be manager to employee feedback, or it might be customer to manager feedback, or it might be sort of market to business feedback. Can we actually measure how we're doing? And reward. So obviously, if the feedback is good, then what kind of rewards is the business benefiting from this? And is this a very slow process? Is it something that takes years to develop and perfect, or is it something that's very, very quick and we can see almost instantly how we're doing and what we're going to get out of it? So Deal and Kennedy would say that if you are in a high risk, rapid feedback environment, then you have a tough guy macho culture. So the tough guy macho culture often applies to fast-paced organisations like financial markets and stock exchanges. It can also apply to socially risky environments like the police force. It could apply to things like surgeons, or professional sports clubs where there's a high amount of financial investment, and obviously the feedback is very quick because you see on a match-to-match basis the reward of each investment of each player and their performance in a game. So this is what we call the tough guy macho type cultures. If you've got quite a rapid feedback but your risk is relatively low, you have what we call a work hard, play hard culture. And this is typically in organisations with fast-paced, consumer-orientated business. So restaurants and hotels, for example, stress is likely to come from the pace of the work. You're rapidly getting feedback from your customers. You're going to have rapid complaints if things are going wrong. You can see exactly how the business is being measured at the time, and so there's an awful lot of stress involved with ensuring that standards are being met. But when we actually talk about the level of risk in general, the day-to-day individual customer risk is relatively low. There's not a huge investment from one client to the next. We call this a work hard, play hard culture. And then we have what we call the company culture, where we go back into a high risk environment, but where feedback and reward is slow. So maybe we're investing in high stakes, high risk environments, but we actually don't know how we're doing. We can't really measure our performance against the rest of the market for some time. This may need development, for example, the pharmaceutical industries, where there's huge risk as far as the amount of investment involved, but it can take years and years, it can take decades to get drugs that are produced to be sold on the open market through pharmaceutical industries. Other similar results could be in oil exploration, for example, or mining. Again, high investment, pretty slow feedback and reward to a certain extent. Or it could be the development of new technologies that are taking a long time to perfect and to get into the process. So high risk, but it's quite risky as well, in the sense that we really don't know how we're doing. It's difficult to measure how we're doing. And then we have process environments. You might see these as the sort of snail culture. It's relatively low risk. We've not got a huge amount of investment in each individual project or client, and the feedback and reward is quite slow as well. These are quite bureaucratic organisations, and people tend to get caught up with how things are done, paying attention to the detail rather than the day-to-day. sort of dealing with issues, government departments, insurance agencies might be common examples of these sort of process cultures, just going through the process, following the policies. It's very paperwork based. So these are Diehl & Kennedy's 4 cultures. So if you're confident in Charles Handy's and you're confident in Diehl & Kennedy's, then to be perfectly honest with you, you've got enough to be able to apply to any of the case studies that are going to come up. There are other ones. There is Cotter and Heskett, which we have talked about before. This is adaptive cultures and inert cultures. And very simply, it talks about cultures that are ready to change, cultures that are ready to innovate and ready to adapt themselves into new environments like Google or Amazon or Apple. Usually cultures in technological fields have to be adaptive. And then you have inert cultures, and these are the cultures that are resistant to change. They might be quite inward looking, but they hold traditional values at their core, and they hold on to the traditions of their business. So certain legal firms and certain opportunities to deliver a historically relevant service, something that people expect to be the same today as it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. They may need more of an inert culture and need to see less change because there's a sort of familiarity of that from their client. But in general, a lot of the time, adaptive cultures are seen as those that can survive in today's environment because they're the ones that are prepared to change, whereas inert cultures are seen as those that will often be left behind by the changing demographics and changing technology and things like that. So those are the 3 sort of main areas of corporate culture. As I said, there are other theories, but you don't have to have all of them in great detail. It doesn't come up very regularly in exam case studies. So that takes us on to employee and employer relations. So what we're talking about here is what happens when there is a conflict between a group of employees and their employer, or between the employer and the employees. So maybe somebody feels that they are being mistreated, or they feel that employees are not doing their job to their capability, and rather than as an individual, it may well be as a group. There is what we call representation or representatives of the employee, because obviously the employer represents a company, and usually that company will have a human resource department or legal representation for a firm representing the business, and they're seen as sort of the larger and more powerful group, whereas employees, especially as individuals, may feel that they don't have the same power as the company that they're fighting against. So these representations for employees come in the form of trade unions. A trade union is a group, it's a collective group of employees who provide a sort of strength in numbers protection against any kind of bullying that might occur from the employer. And these are needed because sometimes poor working relationships between employees and employers will lead to low morale or conflict and disagreements, and then we lead into what we call industrial unrest or industrial action. So the most common type of industrial action is strike action. We've all seen that before. It's not by any means the only method of industrial action, and there should be various steps that are taken before that comes to a head. But the first thing that employees will often do is to turn to their trade union for support, and the employer will look to their human resource department or their legal department to ensure that that they're behaving in a way that's not going to land the company in any trouble, and is going to ensure that anything that is carried out is done so above board and without potentially leading to court cases. So from the employee's perspective, quite regularly if there is a problem, we start with what we call collective bargaining. And collective bargaining is negotiations, but negotiations not from one employee but from a collective group of employees. So those collective employees will come together under the bracket of their trade union, and their trade union representative will go into meetings with the management, and they will bargain for, they will campaign for and negotiate around the table for what the employees are looking for. And usually it's to do with things like fairer working hours, or an increase in wage, or better conditions in the workplace, or fairer pensions, etc. It's often to do with these issues. If that collective bargaining doesn't work, then there are four main actions that the employee may take. And as I say, it's usually not one, this is the collective group. So these are the groups of people represented by these trade unions. Employees will pay to be a member of one of these trade unions. And so the first one you have that trade unions and employees will use is a go slow. That means I will continue to do my job, I will continue to carry out the functions of my job description, but I will do so at the most slow and inconvenient pace possible. Thus reducing productivity and output for the business. The second option is what we call work to rule, and this means I will do my job, but I will only do what is required of me based upon my job description. I will follow the lines of my job description to the letter. So anything additional, any goodwill that I offer to the business in terms of additional services that I offer, or additional roles that we all take on just as part and parcel of getting the day-to-day running of the company done, that just goes straight out the window. So an example of this in most schools is that teachers might be employed to arrive at school at 8 and leave at 4:30 and teach 6 classes a day and do their marking, but it doesn't actually say that we're also required to do clubs or duties or tutorials, or meet with students to support them in their IAs and things like that. So if a teacher was to go on strike, they may say, okay, well, I'm going to arrive at 8, I'm going to teach my 6 lessons, I'm going to leave at 4:30, and I'm not going to do a second more. I'm not going to do any duties or tutorials or clubs or trips or anything over and above my specific job description. That's a work to rule. And this is particularly powerful in companies where employees show quite a lot of goodwill, that willingness to put in over and above their job description. Then we have overtime bans, and this often happens in companies where employees are paid per hour, and employees might be paid per hour on, say, a 30-hour contract or a 35-hour contract, but at busiest times of the year, or due to sickness or holiday of other staff, sometimes it's necessary for the business to ask employees to take overtime, to work more than the 35 hours. Now, they get paid for this, and quite often they'll get paid, not just their base salary, but perhaps even their base salary and a half for each of those hours, so 1.5 hour pay sort of thing. Overtime bans mean that they all refuse to put in anything more than their 30 hours or their 35 hours. So this is an interesting one, because obviously it has negative connotations for the employees as well, because a lot of employees like overtime in the fact that it gives them more money, but it's very inconvenient for businesses who have got additional hours to be met and simply don't have the staff to meet those demands and needs, so they fall short of meeting the demands of their clients as well. And then last but not least, we have strike action. You all know what strike action is, when we refuse to do our jobs, but this should really be a last resort. Collective bargaining should be the first choice on the table, because it can cause a win-win situation for employees and employers, coming to a safe negotiation, whereas the other options have got downsides for both employee and employer. So strike action should not be just taken without at least the process of trying to sit around the negotiation table first. So this can be put in place by employees who are disgruntled by their employers. What actions can be taken by the employer who are unhappy with their employees? Well, again, the first port of call should be this collective bargaining, this process of sitting around the table and actually negotiating out what needs to happen. If this can't get to the a stage where all parties are happy moving forward, what usually happens next is the threats of redundancies. Businesses generally won't just make people redundant for no reason. This comes about because the business can't afford to keep those roles in the way that they're currently delivered. Through the fact of a downfall in the economy, through problems with suppliers, through problems with not keeping up with their competitors, businesses find themselves in economic downfall, and therefore redundancies potentially have to be made. And what might be happening in this sense is that employers might be saying to employees, listen, we can't afford to keep going as we are, so we need to look at the possibility of a pay freeze, which means you're not going to have a raise next year, or even a pay cut. And we need to look at the possibility of reducing some people's contracted hours if we're going to keep everybody employed. Then the employees may come to the negotiating table and say that this isn't fair. Well, what may come next is the employer saying, well, if you can't accept some of this, then we'll have no choice but to make people redundant. Another thing that employers will try to do potentially is to change contracts, and that's what I was talking about. They may come to the table to say we can keep jobs if people are prepared to take a pay cut or reduce their working hours, or work from home so that we don't have to pay for office space or whatever it is. But change of contracts may be something that the employer has to look at in order to manage their workforce problems. Then we have closure and lockouts, and closure is a pretty extreme measure, really. Closure literally means to close a factory or a warehouse or a store because they've not managed to come to an agreement with the employees, and maintaining that places open is not feasible with this disruption and with these arguments ongoing. And of course, closure will result in those employees essentially losing their jobs, essentially not being able to work and to earn. And this is very difficult for businesses to go through. They don't particularly. It's not a beneficial option for most, and most businesses will want to reach an agreement before it gets to that stage. Lockouts are a little bit like a forced strike, where the business, instead of closing permanently, the business basically locks the doors to the factory and won't allow people to work until an agreement has been made, whether that be on changing contracts or whatever else. And of course, during the times when those employees are not working, a lot of the time they won't also be receiving pay. So this is sort of forcing employees to sit back down around the table and to make an agreement that they may not be fully happy with, but obviously in this sense the power may be outside of their control. So these are some of the methods used by employers when trying to reach an agreement around the table. So those finishes summarising chapter 2. The next video posted will be starting the introduction of chapter 3, which is the finance chapter.